Welcome to the Whole of Us podcast, where we share personal stories and intimate conversations about becoming more human together. I'm Reverend Angela Jernigan, a community-based minister, parent educator, and soul care companion in Berkeley, California. These episodes are rooted in a shared longing for what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called beloved community, a world shaped by love, equity, justice, and belonging for all. Through stories and conversations with friends and colleagues on the front lines of personal, family, and community healing and transformation, we'll explore an emerging story of human wholeness. Come on in, listen in, and be at home with us. It was 30 years ago. I had just come back from a long run on the streets of West Philadelphia. I was a senior in college, finishing my thesis on the social construction of race. Whiteness was my area of focus. But this particular evening, I wasn't writing. I had taken a break to have a long run through the city and back, and then I took a hot shower. It was now evening time, and I laid out on my futon in my bedroom, and then suddenly I felt something completely inexplicable. The presence of my grandfather who had just died a few weeks before. My grandfather who had been a minister in life and who had been the sweetest, funniest, most gentle soul. He was suddenly here in my bedroom in West Philadelphia, and he woke up every cell in my body. It was like I was vibrating, and my hands got hot. I felt like I had fire in my hands, and he stayed a while. It wasn't exactly like we had a conversation because there weren't words, but I knew he was communicating with me. I knew he was visiting me to give me something. And the first thing he gave me was a feeling of embodied prayer. That's the only way I know to explain it. It was as if I woke up to the reality of being embedded in God. And I knew that at my core, I was communing with the sacred. He just woke this up in me. It had been here all along. It was the place where I was most me, suddenly alive. And then he gave me his calling to ministry. He had been a Christian minister in a small, conservative Christian denomination in his lifetime. And I really was not interested in receiving a call to ministry, not one bit. 7 years before, the church I had been raised in, the church that my parents started when I was a very young child, they kicked us out. They kicked actually mostly my father out because my father had just come out as gay. They kicked us out when I was 16 because although they said they were a community that believed in unconditional love and the radical inclusivity of God, somehow when my dad came out as gay, that was out of bounds. And they kicked him out, and my whole family went with him. From that time on, I was not at all interested in church. I was not at all interested in God. I was not at all interested in anyone who would reject my father, who I experienced as the same loving man of profound integrity that he had ever been. He just now happened to be gay. So I was not interested in church. I was not interested in Christianity. I was not interested in God. I was certainly not interested in a call to ministry. But something was happening. Something happened that evening that was undeniable. Something that I couldn't ignore. Something that would take me quite a long time to process and make sense of and figure out how to incorporate into my life. I tried to explore every possible way that I could live out this sense of calling without having to deal with Christians or Christianity. So I explored and I did a lot of seeking. I felt the calling was real, and I knew it, and I knew it was going to shape the rest of my life. My calling took me both deeply inward and outward into spaces and places that I never would have imagined. This life of embodied prayer that my grandfather had awakened me to seized me. I spent hours every morning in deep experiences of prayer, and I created a lot of artwork. It was contemplative, and it was creative, and it was riveting. It took me 5 years from that night with my grandfather before I went to seminary. And then it took me 5 years to get through a 3-year program in seminary. And then it took me 5 more years before I became ordained. And throughout this time, I was contending with my history in church. I was contending with the history of my lineage, the history of white Protestant Christianity. There was a lot to wrestle with there, and I wrestled. My outward calling brought me to inner city neighborhoods and communities that had been cut off from the resources of the whole of the city, where people were experiencing hunger, housing insecurity, and ultimately violence. My calling led me into inner cities around the entire country, where people were organizing to create change around some of the most devastating human conditions in our country, and into prisons and jails, and for me, most poignantly, juvenile justice systems, where I met young people, young women, girls, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, who were locked up for prostitution. Children locked up for prostitution, and they thought it was their fault. Where young men were locked up for dealing drugs or wielding guns because they had come from neighborhoods where there were no opportunities for them, where the most thriving business in their community was the drug trade. Young men who were being punished, sometimes as adults, for reaching for the only option available to them in their community. My outer calling brought me to some places and some spaces that are unforgettable. And in order to be there, I also had to be here. My calling also brought me to the other end of the social spectrum, deep into the inner workings of families of relative social privilege, families where On the surface, it looked like they had everything handed to them, but where relationships were broken, where parents could not connect to their young children because of their own trauma, families that had come out of legacies that were disconnected and broken, where young people were neglected, where parents struggled mightily to know how to be with the vulnerability of a baby, of a young child. My calling, which started 30 years ago in West Philadelphia with an inexplicable encounter with my recently dead grandfather, is yes, very unique and specific to me. And it did lead me to ordained ministry in the Christian church, although I go about it a little differently. I've come to believe that while the calling on each life may in some ways be highly specific, and many are not related to traditional religion, many callings are artistic, they're creative, they're healing. There's so many varieties of calling, but the soul calling belongs to all of us, each and every one, every human who comes in to this world, every baby that comes through, comes with a soul purpose and a path all their own, like a little seed that comes in, and inside that seed is the size and shape of the oak tree yet to come. Every soul that comes in, no matter what faith tradition they're part of or not part of, every soul that comes in is here to contribute to human wholeness. And we have the power to listen that forth in one another. That's what this podcast is about. It's about the calling to participate in healing and wholeness of our lives, of our families and communities. This podcast is going to be a place where I share my stories. It's also going to be a place where I have conversations with the people who inspire me most in the world, people who've become dear friends, colleagues, chosen family, people who have shaped my life with their dedication to their calling, people who are going into some of these spaces that are most deeply troubled in our world and bringing out healing and hope in those spaces. And my hope and my prayer is that as you listen, you might feel the calling of your own deep soul. Thanks so much for listening to the Whole of Us podcast. This podcast is a project of the Soul Care Studio and the Family Spirit Center in Berkeley, California. If you'd like to come in closer and support the work, you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter, Soul Care Studio News. The link is in the show notes. Please know that 10% of all my earnings are shared with local frontline leaders, my friends and colleagues who are serving the most vulnerable in our local community. Until next time, take good care.